yeah, good morning to everyone. Very happy to introduce you to Dr. Jason van Niekerk, our speaker for today. Jason's a very regular participant in our seminar, always ready with very interesting, pertinent questions. But he styles himself as a recovering academic, whatever that might mean. I think we'll have to hear a bit from that. And he says he relapses into precarious teaching positions in philosophy. And this is after a PhD and a postdoc research on African philosophy. And he's now involved in a YouTube project on philosophical unsettlement. So if we're going back to Germany and, Heidegger, it will be Unheimlichkeit, it's a feeling of not being at home. Very, very interesting topic now, I think, for these days. So he's going to be talking to us today about humor as a mode of relief. Relief from what, though? That's the question. And this from what that we need, from which we need relief. He's given that the metaphor of Zozobra, an existential anxiety that we feel in the absence of a shared horizon of understanding. Also very pertinent, I think, for today's world. So he'll speak of an incident, Don't Touch Me on My Studio, as an example of a moment of relief where a common horizon of understanding was reestablished. So Jason, thank you and welcome. And yes, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Andrea and Jenna and all who are participating. So I'm going to jump into this description here, see how it goes. For what it's worth, I am in fact wearing that T-shirt, but I posted the picture from a moment when there was slightly less of me and the T-shirt was less worn, just like I was. But I'm hoping this incident will come back. So I'm going to see how skipping ahead through this works. So to start off with, I've been very interested, as Andrea noted, in the seminar, the idea of social cohesion and the idea of this year-long project of being engaged with looking at what humor can do for social cohesion. And the paradigm example that I came back to, that popped into my head and that I kept thinking of in this context, is this idea, this moment, and I'm going to lodge that. I know that it may not be familiar to everyone, and some of us will be remembering it quite vividly, but I will come back and explain this moment. But for me, the paradigm example of an interaction between humor and social cohesion in a very tense context was this incident from 2010, which became a meme and became a social phenomenon, the Touch Me on My Studio incident. And I'll come back to that, but this idea has been interesting to me for a while. And what crystallized something to say about this for me was the idea that there's a way to characterize the underlying tension that humor relates to or interacts with in these moments. So characteristic of me, although I like things that are funny, I'm actually going to spend a surprising amount of time focused on the anxiety that we feel, which is very, very me. But let me jump into how this goes. So the quick thing to note about this instance is that it was sort of a moment of tension in which political tension had been uncertain, and I'll follow through on what that means in a moment. But that there was a thing that's in some ways familiar, but in other ways hasn't been reiterated as often in our shared culture, of collectively laughing at the absurdity of a tense situation. And I'm going to want to leave lots of space open for what it means to laugh collectively, but we'll come to that. So when I say that there's a relief from social tension, what is it that I'm talking about? And my apologies, I thought I had a nice set of fading in bullet points set up, and I turn out to have been wrong about that. Please bear with me. I hope it'll be the least of our tech failures. So I found this handy term that comes from Mexican existentialism, but before that from Mexican Spanish, Zozobra, which, if you look for a straightforward definition, will be understood as, translate as distress or anxiety. And I'm not aiming simply to appropriate a fancy sounding word. There's a particular meaning to the specific construction of this word that I'm interested in. And what that meaning is comes from where it emerged from. So I just want to say, I've felt for a while that there's a lot to be said for connections. I see occasional parallels between the Mexican and South African situations, but I hope I can point to a more general sense in which this is relevant. But what Mexico in the early 20th century and South Africa post-1994 have in common is a sort of uncertain set of positions in a nation-building project, which was being imposed after a somewhat successful but significantly problematic revolutionary moment. And what's interesting is what you have emerging in Mexican philosophy in that moment was this question of why is it that the Mexican character seems to be a certain way? Why is it that we seem to struggle with certain characteristic or dispositional difficulties? And this was emerging in comparison to the very much more recent sort of European sense of something like national characters echoing in the background. So you had the sense that there was something characteristic of this kind of post-revolutionary, post-colonial society. And it wasn't a complementary self-assessment, but it was a self-assessment. So you had a number of Mexican philosophers who were interested in this question of why do we feel this distress, this anxiety? Why does this seem to be what defines our interactions with one another? And one answer would be, well, there were people on opposite sides of a revolutionary war who are now living, coexisting with one another uneasily. But there was a broader approach here. So in the work of Emilio Orongo and Octavio Paz, there was this description of Orongo as the one who did significant work on this idea of zozobra, of feeling anxious as a disposition. So you had this whole community of philosophers kind of articulating a feeling that was extant in Mexican society, that what are we like compared to these secure Germans and French and people who have this coherent sense of national identity. And it was the idea that as individuals and interacting as a community, there was a disposition toward feeling fragile, toward feeling anxious, toward feeling easily defeated, being prone towards emphasizing the sense in which there are daily defeats, and cynicism about the likelihood of anything being effective. And it was also understood that there was this national character of facing defeat in day-to-day life, a retreat into an interior life, into a kind of daydream-oriented approach. And the idea was that this was taken to be related to this background condition of we experience anxiety, we are unhappy, we are upset. And this resonates for me. I don't know if anyone else can identify with that feeling, but as a South African, I could relate to that. I've noted the South African proverb, we are suffering. There's a certain emphasis in when faced with these daily frustrations, in this kind of sense of defeat, of frustration. But that's quite important because what had happened with some of the earlier approaches, Orongo and Paz, was that they'd inherited this essentialist tendency to read this as something about an essential national character, or as some characteristic flaw that we all collectively have as members of a certain community. And what you get that's distinct from that, and why this existentialist reading of Zozobra is interesting enough that I don't just use the term angst. I'm not just talking about anxiety in some broader sense, is that Portilla had this other reading where he said that what's going on here is co-constituted. It's a function of our existential condition, living as beings who want to orient ourselves toward the future, toward those around us, and depend on our community in order to understand how we find that sense of orientation, the sense of horizon against which we orient ourselves. And over here, Francisco Gallegos is the person who actually his writing pointed me toward this material when he was writing about applying this concept of Zozobra to post-Trump America. And he says that what is noteworthy is that rather than a psychological state we are stuck in, this existentialist account we get from Portilla indicates that this is an existential condition. This isn't going away because of therapy. This is something that can and must be resolved only at the level of communal undertaking, of a communal resetting of expectations. So I find that interesting. I love that it gives us traction, and I think that that conception is useful. But let's have a quick look at where this is coming from. So what Portilla says is, he says, we want to understand what a community is as a horizon. And his example, as my excellent layout there indicates, his example was, let's take a look at the experience of being in a queue to vote. And he even invokes Descartes and says, look, imagine you're standing in a queue, getting ready to vote, and an evil demon comes along, takes away your memory of what's going on here. All you know is whatever you're doing is important in some sense. So you know that these actions are freighted with meaning. What you don't get to know is what that meaning is or how it will be interpreted. And he suggests that this is an absurd situation. Were we to find ourselves in this situation, we would be lost. And what this points to is that it is our community's shared understanding of what the purpose of our actions is, the shared interpretation of our experience, which lets us understand these actions, communal actions, as not being absurd. So he says, we understand, therefore, community as a horizon of understanding, a horizon of meaning that's generated. The expectation that there is a shared meaning that will be affirmed by those around us confers that meaning. And in its absence, what we do is absurd. Finding ourselves standing in this queue without an understanding would be absurd. This allows us to orient our being toward a distinct horizon. And what's important is that this is a mutually coherent meaning, right? We have to know that our actions are being understood together. If some of us understand what we're doing as having a certain meaning and others understand it as having a vastly different, radically different meaning, we've got a problem. It isn't simply the idea that there might be another context in which our actions could be received, but the idea that we cannot predict what context our actions will be interpreted in. So Portilla explains this as where our sense of frustration and of defeatism comes from, that there are political contexts in which we do not have an expectation that our actions could be coherently understood by others as the actions we think they are. And this is disorienting. We lose our sense of horizon. And this is, I also like the analogy of bewildering. We're left in a wilderness, somewhat lost. We don't understand what will happen. Let's have a quick look at a couple of examples of this. So Portilla's primary examples are bribery and haggling. He says that what happens when a public official asks for a bribe is that our expectation that what will govern our interaction with them comes from their purpose, their role, their public position, and our experience and position as a member of the public is undermined. And we now have to deal with the idea that there will be an interpersonal engagement where how we perform and how we fit their specific needs becomes the new demand made on us. And it changes our experience. And he says the same for haggling. Both of these, bribery and haggling, were understood in this Mexican conversation as being absent from the more unified European context. Whether that's true or not is a separate point. They're taken as paradigmatic of the Mexican experience. And boy, are they familiar to me and my experience. And what's going on here is that we cannot understand whether our engagements with others will be understood in this broader context, in the way we want them to be, in the way we intend them to be. I want to note that this is very much like traffic. They say that traffic never reduces itself as a source of stress in our lives because you don't get used to traffic as a single entity. What traffic is a word for having to make numbers, a large number of micro decisions, one after the other. And it's never the same ones, and it's never the ones you're used to. It's being presented by an unpredictable, unforeseeable set of specific demands and not even being able to know in advance what they will be. So the idea here is when we have reason to expect that, and when there are maybe some contexts in which we could expect our actions, our meanings, and the things that we depend on for our projects to be proceeding under a certain set of circumstances, but what actually happens is a very different set, we face this frustration. And this leads us to the anxiety that is characterized here as Zozobra. So some other examples that I'm throwing out here. So racial and political tension, not knowing in certain circumstances how our actions will be interpreted, whether people with vastly different views to our own will read us as allies or antagonists, and on what grounds, right? Vaccination status. This once may have seemed simple enough, but I don't know what declaring my own or discussing my intention to vaccinate my child will mean anymore, because it can be taken to indicate vastly different things, and I can't know in advance how that will be read. The same quite recently goes for mask wearing, and I've added load shedding. Hard to imagine why that's popped into my head, but there is something about expecting that you can commit to certain projects on certain deadlines with certain comfort, and then knowing that that may or may not be the case. And in fact, what you face is an entirely unpredictable set of circumstances. Now, in that instance, it's the circumstances that are uncertain rather than the reception. But I nonetheless think there's a parallel to the kind of anxiety that generally gets ratcheted up. And I think, as Jonathan Haidt has recently argued in his couple of New York Times articles, that this is also true of how we engage online generally now, that you cannot know what the context of reception for your engagements will be, and you can't even expect that they will be understood coherently. So this is, I think, a familiar kind of experience. This Zozobra as a response to uncertainty about reception is a difficult one. And now I'm going to pull us back. With that said, let me go back to my paradigm case. So some refreshers. Way back in April 2010, we had the sort of moment of the wearing off of confidence about the Rainbow Nation. We had the emergence of general societal difficulties. This was around the time that the mainstream adoption of the phrase service delivery protests popped up. And that was a way of trying to sanitize tensions emerging from people being dissatisfied with the general condition of life and violently responding to that, or with increasing antagonism. Against this background, this show on ETV, Africa 360, invited as panelists, Lebohang Peko, who was a political analyst and a Black woman representing a government side position, or at least sympathetic to it, and the fairly antagonistic leader of a white militia group, Andre Fasafi, who had recently inherited that position after the previous leader had been murdered. And this context led to a confrontation over who was speaking and who was interrupting whom, which led to Fasaki standing up in a threatening way towards the Black female guest, which led to the host, Chris Maroleng, intervening. And this situation, I just want to point out, is it was a metonym for a greater set of tensions and a lack of certainty about what the state of a dispensation was. This was the kind of bossy, intrusive return of a kind of struggle over racialized context and identities that had seemed not to have been present, or at least wasn't part of the normal narrative of what South Africa understood itself as being like in sanitized public spaces. So you had this emergence, this sudden tension, this uncertainty about what was happening. And in the context of this particular instance, there was a malapropism. Rather than saying, as one might if one had thought it through carefully, don't touch my guest in my studio, don't touch me when you are in my studio, Chris Maroleng said, don't touch me on my studio. And this immediately was picked up by Fasaki as, I will touch you on the studio. And this led to this strangely extended moment of broken syntax. Mr. Fasaki, don't touch me on my studio. I am touching you on your studio. And it was bizarre. It was strange. But more importantly, in the immediate aftermath of this strangeness, it wasn't certain how that was going to be received by the public generally. It wasn't clear what was going to happen. Was this going to be a pile-on the host for a slippage of perfect English usage? Was this going to be a reemergence of recidivist views? Was it going to break down along racial lines? What was going to happen? And what happened was a sequence of jokes, was what we now recognize as the very familiar spreading of a hashtag, was people sharing this video, sharing jokes about it, Nando's picking up. Suddenly, in no time whatsoever, Twitter overflowed with people making jokes about, wow, it's after a few years of marriage, my husband never touches me on my studio. You had places advertising their products by saying, you're allowed to touch our studio. This became a joke. Everyone had a version of the joke. Everyone came at it from a different approach. Everyone laughed together. And within 48 hours, there were 2 or 3 different remixes of popular songs featuring this mixed in as a backbeat, featuring aspects of the song. It was impossible not to joke about touching on studios in this moment. And what was going on there is, I want to say the following. There was a ratcheting up of tension. There was a sense of relief. What we were doing, what people participating in this moment were doing, was pointing to a moment as experienced communally. Against a background of uncertainty about what the reception of this moment was, there was this collective understanding that we were pointing to something and pointing to it as absurd. What this was spontaneous and responsive. It was open, and it was playful. It was happening largely on social media, but then it was being remixed by people with professional equipment on platforms. Hilariously, some of the examples of this were taken down from YouTube because the dominant thought at the time was, well, I don't know if it was really my best work. Do I want to put that on YouTube where millions of people will want to look at it? That's precious in retrospect. But what was happening here was this open, playful, spontaneous engagement in a shared joke. And I want to point out that a way to read that is not simply as all of us participated in observing a moment of tension and then laughing at it and feeling relief. I don't think this was just the biological response. I think what was going on there is that served as part of a shared co-construction of an attitude. And that attitude was broad, and it was quite likely not a single position, right? It wasn't simply taking sides. It definitely wasn't deciding that one person had specifically made a specific mistake. It was that the whole moment of this tension was uncomfortable, unwanted, and something that we collectively could agree was absurd. And what it wasn't was a return to the ordering of who has a right to speak that Fasaki had imagined he was participating in when he asserted himself. Nor was it a simple denial of that. It was a response to this as an absurd moment that we collectively laughed about. And that's, I want to argue, the thing that is the antidote to a deep uncertainty about how things will be interpreted. These moments of interpreting together, of co-creating. And what made this exemplary of that, I think, and the reason why I reached all the way back to 2010 for this example, and I don't have lots and lots of examples of similar things, is that this happened at an early stage of things going viral via video. It's been said that Tom Cruise's career took a particular hit because something he did at a certain moment on a couch in front of Oprah was taken out of context and reposted in the funniest possible context at a certain moment in the emergence of YouTube. So something like that was happening here. But I also want to note another feature here. There was a spontaneous audience. All of us were an audience. This was not something that was repackaged for a pre-existing audience that was primed for a partisan reading. We have a significantly more balkanized media landscape now, which repackages incidents like this, and it's harder for something to break out as a spontaneous instance that we all interpret together. I don't think it's impossible, but I'll come back to that. So here are a couple of other examples of the same, I think possibly the same shared construction of meaning. So I want to note, I think most hashtag jokes aim to work something like this, and many of the ones that go viral do. But since this happened this week, I'm just going to point to two other things. So my former office mate and something of a media celebrity himself, Eusebius McKaiser, noted when load shedding was announced, rolling blackouts that were going to impact us. No one, absolutely no one, Eskom, we regret from 4 p.m. And this was the announcement that there would be rolling blackouts. He then followed that up. As you can see, I was going to fade in, but whatever, it's all up there. He followed that up with that Eskom should be honest and replace we regret with no regrets that we are shedding. Now, what's going on here is pointing to a common hardship, a shared experience of frustration. And I think that pointing to a shared experience is a crucial feature of what's going on here. And it makes all of us who are subject to this deep inconvenience, this deep uncertainty about what happens next and the need to negotiate it. It makes us a shared, receptive, spontaneously generated audience to that experience. But I also want to note one other thing. Eusebius ended his second comment there with the phrase bloody agents, which is a callback to yet another thing that happened in the South African media when, similar to the "Don't Touch Me on My Studio" moment, Julius Malema referring to a journalist as a bloody agent became viral, got remixed in a range of songs. And I note that because I don't know if there is a fixed meaning. The term bloody agent is used in ways that are necessarily joking, necessarily carry a freight of a certain history of antagonism and absurdism. It is not being used seriously in this context, and I think it can be understood that way. But I think that people could read that reference to Malema saying bloody agent still in a number of ways. But what I don't think they could do is choose to read it without the context of intended and understood joking reference to a loaded political situation. And I think that points to something that may or may not help me, but I think what it points to is that there does seem to be a kind of closure, a kind of reorienting around things that we collectively decide are absurd or funny together in these circumstances, and it can persist. Quick note, what is the antithesis of what I'm talking about here? Just recently, Rob Schneider, the former Saturday Night Live comedian, said on a conservative podcast that he thought that Saturday Night Live ended the moment Kate McKinnon sang Hallelujah, pretending to be Hillary Clinton when Clinton lost the American election a few years ago. And I think it's worth noting that conservatives always insist that no one is being civil and demand that others be better when it's a way of shutting their opponents up. But it's also worth noting that if there's, and here's something I never expected to say in an academic context, if there is a charitable reading of Rob Schneider in this situation, I think it is that there is something about what that response was that is the antithesis of relieving tension. So it ratcheted up, or spoke to a ratcheting up of political tension, but it did not grant a sense of relief. It pointed to a moment, but through a specific and partisan reading. There was not a communal understanding in the American national political community that this had the value that it was being described as having. And I think what it pointed to was not absurdity, but to moral shock, which Katie Stockdale has pointed to quite a lot. And I don't think that you can bond over the experience of moral shock in the same way. But I'm going to try not to take all the question time, so I'll leave that as something we can discuss more. It was a playful engagement, but it was not spontaneous. It was not open to others. It was not co-constructing meaning. It was a premeditated interpretation in partisan grounds. I'm not saying that that is not something that comedy is entitled to do, but I want to note that it's an example of when comedy addresses these shared moments, but does not do so in a way which is spontaneously open to co-constituting meaning across these fraught divides. So what do I want to end on there? Shared humor can be used either to co-constitute meaning or to reinforce factional contempt. And we have a lot of experience of this in what I've described as our current media landscape. There are meme groups, there are whole meta memes about the idea that the left can't meme and the right can't meme, and people feed each other in preconceived contexts of reception, the ideas that this other group are the ones we should laugh at in this situation because they don't understand. And these contexts reinforce the idea that we can hold others in contempt. What they don't do is collectively hold something up as absurd and engage with it. So I think there may be space for any of those kinds of humor, but I want to note that only by co-constituting meaning, only by showing something as absurd in a context in which it can be understood as absurd together, and we share our befuddlement and then attempt to generate new meanings, do we address the feeling that we can't be certain how others will interpret the events that we're experiencing together. So there's something somewhat defeating, self-defeating about this contempt-oriented approach to humor. That doesn't mean there's no place for it, but it does mean it can't do this thing that we might want humor to do. Open questions, I think, here are how important is spontaneity to this? Is it possible to find ways in performance and preparation to cultivate or generate something of a more open audience? Does the event have to be unplanned for us to have the open, spontaneous engagement? I don't know. And is there a way to optimize performances of humor, engagements with these things in order to assist us in reorienting? Is this something that professionals could take into account in terms of their approach to audience? I'm not sure of that myself. And that's where I am. I will now take direction as you help me to co-constitute what anything I've just said means.
Jason, thanks. Wow, lots to think about. So I'm going to just thank you for a fascinating presentation. I have a couple of questions I want to ask you, but we would like the rest of the audience to speak first. Otherwise, you only hear our voices. So I'm going to hand you over to Jenna, and she will kind of negotiate questions and answers.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Jason. I so enjoyed that. I've enjoyed since becoming part of the seminars this year, certainly your questions, as you know, and I've often typed to you in chat, have been so thought-provoking. And somehow you managed to draw concepts together that I would never even think about putting together to conceptualize a subject or a certain field. So it was particularly nice for me to see your presentation today, and that just comes through in your presentation as well as in your topic, in the examples you use, the scholars you refer to. So that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much. While we wait, I know Andrea does have a question for you. So while we wait for everyone else to gather their thoughts, because you've made us think so hard today on a Friday afternoon, now heading into afternoon, I'm going to hand over to Andrea to pose her question to you. Okay.
Okay, yay, good. Me first. Jason, it's something that I want to draw Belinda into this conversation too, because it's something that she spoke about in her seminar in our 2 years ago, I think, on our pandemic seminar. She spoke about grief, and in it there was this festival of burning Zozobra. I don't know if you are aware of that. So this is one of the things that goes right back to the beginning of your talk. It's a kind of a ritual enactment of taking this figure and giving away your anxieties and fears and griefs. And then my question to you was, does that kind of ritual enactment of a kind of festival of burning Zozobra every year, would that create the existential condition and perpetuate it, kind of instead of resolving it? You were talking about the fact that it needs community resetting. This is a ritual of community resetting in a way, but does it then, if you have to do this every year, then is Zozobra like traffic in a way that it just can't be resolved? So that would be my question in a way. Does humor do something different from a kind of ritual enactment of giving, kind of giving away your grief?
I think that's a great question. And yeah, when I was, as one of those people who read this stuff in APA's newsletter and had to work very hard to work out the pronunciation, one of the first things I came across was when I was Googling frantically, was this New Mexico Zozobra festival, which is very much American and interesting. And I think that it points to this larger thing, and I think this goes back to earlier in the year, we were talking about Igbo tendencies to take people down a peg and to ensure that others in community don't feel too entrenched in their position through, gentle insults. Because yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what I think is interesting is that I've also, just to bring in yet another of those random things, I've been reading Graeber and Wengrove's anarchist reinterpretation of the history of humanity. And they draw a lot of attention to the role of ridicule and the idea that ridicule is used as a tool in many cultures to stop people from feeling too comfortable or entrenched in their positions of power. And that takes us back. The Zozobra sort of festival is quite similar to May Day festivals and old pagan traditions in Europe, where you have this kind of inversion of the positions of power. And I think there's something to be said for the fact that what those try to do is create a ritual space where you can remind people not to be too secure. And a lot has been said about praise singers in South Africa, about how the traditional role of a praise singer is precisely that they have the power to insult the person they are praising in order to keep them humble. And many praises inaugurating people in power explicitly involve lists of why they need to be careful and what they've done wrong before. So I think what I want to say to that is, I think what we see on Twitter when a hashtag goes crazy, when we're not sure how we're interpreting something and everyone decides that this is the latest Karen or something along these lines, it's that happening spontaneously. It's a response where people are doing that thing that the ritual space is generated for. And it might be that precisely because we don't have so many shared standards, especially in multicultural societies, we don't have shared norms for those rituals, that it becomes more important to generate them spontaneously and recognize them as such when we do. Is my thought off the top of my head.
Now, there's something really important, I think, about the difference between the spontaneity of the humor response as opposed to the ritualized kind of regularity of a response that to a condition that in a way keeps it there, keeps it present, keeps it part of the, I suppose, is it the new Mexican identity rather than the actual I'm not sure about that. I'm kind of yeah. But yes, thank you. It's fascinating. Jenna, shall I send it back to you?
Yes, thanks, Andrea.
Okay.
Charles has a question. Charles, can I ask you to please put your camera on and unmute and pose your question to Jason? And welcome. It's lovely seeing you at the seminar. It's the first time I've seen you at the seminar, so that's great.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it's more of just a long-winded comment from my side than a question. So I fully agree also that from from a distance, but also from my life in South Africa, and from what I can see on social media, South Africans deal with Zozobra through humor, and especially also I think in times of crisis. You pointed to something like load shedding, for instance. I know also in terms of crime also that sometimes people would poke fun at it, I guess exactly because of a sense of helplessness they feel, and a sense of existential angst. But I'm also thinking now of what I'm seeing happening right now on social media. Last night, yesterday, of course, the Queen passed away, and there was this outpouring of grief and sympathy last night. In some cases, even I was surprised at some of the people who were expressing sympathy towards all of this. But then it's given way today to a flood of jokes, and my Facebook is mostly South African, so I found that quite interesting. And also because I think in a certain sense, for some people it's ambivalent things. It's kind of like, well, I don't really feel so strongly about it, or I don't really, maybe people have strong feelings against the monarchy, but they don't want to express it right now. But jokes might be one avenue of doing that in a kind of acceptable way, at least in a South African context. So it seems like a distinctly South African thing, also because I know the British can also, they also do very good satire about public figures, but I have a feeling that would probably be absent in this time about the Queen, certainly. And but what I also find is that, when I poke fun at crisis here in Germany, it just falls flat. There's incomprehension at the idea of poking fun at crisis. And so I think it's, in that sense, I also find that, I guess it gives South Africans there's a sense of helplessness with this existential angst, and it provides people with an avenue to deal with that, and also creating social kind of solidarity or a sense of social meaning about a crisis taking place, or maybe sometimes crisis as a daily kind of thing that people experience in their lives. So yeah, that's just long comment from my side. Thank you very much. That's really interesting.
Thanks, Charles. I think something I was tempted to say was, I didn't organize for the Queen to die in time to prove my points. I've not got the resources, but I will say that I think my reading on a lot of approaches to this is actually that it's a good example of that partisan entrenching thing. I've seen a lot of people taking opportunities to take very strongly defined sides on the issue of monarchy, who might not be particularly engaged with it, but it seems like, and this again, everyone should read the Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrove. It's really occupying my mind right now. But they have a lot of interest in the sociological term schismogenesis, where the presence of a position leads one to define oneself in opposition to it. And this turns into a feedback loop where whole cultures can be defined by taking opposite sides on situations. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that makes for a treacherous social situation. Not that it's not, again, also sometimes an important and inescapable feature. So I think what's interesting is that we can be led into these things. And I just want to say, no version of the jokes that are going around about the Queen right now, or almost no version, performs this function of saying, well, this is a weird situation that we can all identify as weird. They're all trying to fix meaning in it. And I think it's a great pointer to how sometimes humor is serving the opposite function to this one that we want. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Charles. Jason, you make me laugh now when you mention the Queen and how you cannot orchestrate all of that. Oh my goodness, that's hilarious. Helen, we love hearing from you. Can I ask you to put your camera on so we can see you? Has Helen left?
Hi, and I've got my mic on.
Oh, there you are.
Too.
Yay.
So I'm doing good. Hello, Jason, and hi everybody. I'm sorry that I was a bit late coming in and I missed the beginning of this, but this is so fabulous. I'm really looking forward already to watching it over again. I love it entirely. And I think there is a really South African thing. It wouldn't, I can't imagine a Canadian moment, but it's so, yeah, it's wonderful. But the comment, and I also like the business of the Zozobra as a cultural, interpersonal, political big thing, not just personal anxiety. What I am going to take issue with is your notion that therapy may not be suitable. I work I'm a counseling philosopher, philosophical counselor. And one of the things that comes to mind is Aristotle talking about the 3 different types of wisdom, and that practical wisdom is politics and ethics. And it's seat of your pants and it's situational and you can't predict it. And it's like traffic, I guess. And so there's something about the connection there that I'm thinking about. This is basically, I'm going to be kind of incoherent here. But that what, in these times of uncertainty, everybody is feeling, many people who I'm talking to are feeling this anxiety and taking it personally. And the thing that is sort of grounding for them is to say, if everything around me is unfamiliar and unknown, I've got to be really aware, I've got to be paying attention, and I've got to have some integrity in my own response. If I don't know who to trust, I'd better be trustworthy myself. Otherwise, I'm not going to know who to suspect if I'm being suspicious myself. So there's also a way to personally respond to this. What this has to do with your topic is probably not very much, except that it made me think about it. So thank you very much. That's me. Okay.
Thank you, Helen. I'm very open to that. In fact, I hope it's true. Because social solutions that require sort of social reform and community structuring, many of our problems, it's, to quote Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, or more to the point, it's the capitalist superstructure. And I would really like it if there are things that can be changed, and it'd be great if there are things that I can work on about myself that can help me to cope with the world, short of total revolutionary change in society. I think it's important to note that we need that. I think what I just find valuable about this existential description is recognizing the extent to which some of these things aren't simply our own fault, but are co-constituted by the obstacles that society throws at us. But it's definitely, I hope, I live every day and hope that there are things I can do to be better able to cope as well.
I just had the thought and then I forgot it. Okay, the other thing is it provides us evidence that the way the world isn't scientific and empirical, and it isn't all laid out, and we have to figure it out again and again. We get more and more proof of that than the folks that are being authoritarian and telling us this is how things are, this is what mental illness is, wada wada. We can say, no, look at the world. It doesn't work like that. The other thing I'm going to put into the chat is SOAS is doing a really nice lecture of international philosophy, and there's one on existentialism that I think gets into some of that. So I'll just put the link in the chat. Mexico, who knew? This is so great, hey?
Thanks very much, Helen. Thank you. Mutlatsi, can I invite you to put your camera on and turn your mic off on and ask your question? Thanks.
I'll turn it on. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Great to finally see you again after forever. Speak to you directly. I'm just wondering, for me, it's like what's been bugging me is our response to the way other people respond to these situations of angst or Zozobra, and I'm looking specifically at how responses to, let's say, black pain. And so I'm thinking, even though it's not directly in terms of memeage and jokes, but I mean, it's still, for me, it still reflects that way of the nature in which we respond to pain. And I'm thinking of like the whole EFF issue with when they did the whole kill the Boer, and how it was considered okay because now it's a response to, it's a historical, what's called historical term, and we must respect that aspect of in a sense, respect that history that comes with that term and stuff. But I'm also like, because I'm also thinking now in terms of like, when we make jokes about the Queen's death, I mean, I want to live in a world where that is free of violence, right? I want to live in a world, for me, and I don't want to replicate that violence. And so in a sense that, but then when we laugh or take pleasure in someone's death, I feel like this violence is still being perpetuated. She did this evil, but I don't want to become her and live in a world where we don't engage with people's pain. But at the same time, I'm also like, yeah, but you're in pain, and I believe you should have the right to express yourself in this way. Well, that it's within you should be able to do this, and I want you to also have that ability to do so. So yeah, can you assist me with just in terms of how does one deal with this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, and you hit something very important there, because what I like about this moment, and again, I'll say it again, I did have to reach back to 2010 to think of this clear example of when we seem to have a kind of consensus about how to address this. There may be others. And it is awkward because you've got some people who are responding in ways that might be very sort of malicious or, well, vicious to these things. And it undermines the idea that I'm pointing to, that what's valuable here is that we can have moments where we come to a collective understanding, and sometimes it's less than that. And I think that's in some ways an inevitability of the fact that so much of our engagement is online now, that we are inevitably exposed to people who are coming at what we're looking at from very different perspectives. And that's what makes it so nice, such a fresh experience there. But something that I'm inclined to say, and I don't know if this is helpful, but I think of Lisa Tessman's concept of burdened virtues, where she says that it might be that there are certain conditions of virtue, being able to forgive, being able to be magnanimous, being able to engage, that simply aren't possible for people existing as oppressed. And it might be true that it would be better for their character were they able to experience those things. But it's also true that it's simply not constitutionally possible to have that kind of attitude, to achieve that kind of distance under those circumstances, and that there's a threshold we should accept for what that means and how we interpret people's processing. And it's a tricky thing, but I think, to go back to what Helen was saying, people process these things from from within different kind of configurations of difficulties in their character from different processes on a journey. And that's kind of what it is that we're all engaging with this thing. And from different perspectives, and social media exposes us to the most vicious takes and the most understandable, but still I feel like if I embrace laughing at that too much, it's going to be bad for my character, and a bunch of other positions. And we have to deal with all of them, right? And sometimes the answer is less social media, but sometimes the answer is actually we can find this solidarity. There are moments when we can find it. And what interests me about this as kind of an edge case is that these moments of laughter seem to point to the idea that maybe we don't have a single fixed interpretation. I don't think that when Yubi Makaiser says Yubing Chacharach and now it's time to call these guys bloody agents, I don't think everyone receives his use of those phrases as the same. But I think that it's inherently coded as something we read as somewhat humorous, as carrying a freight of, you know, that we're trying to joke together when we say it like this. And I think that's something, right? That's something that was created by moments that were co-constituted this way. I don't think that those give us the majority. And I don't know if I've given any answer about what we can do to have them. But you're right, we have this very fraught engagement with so many different points and people at so many different points. And it can be completely overwhelming, which is itself part of the thing which can lead to us feeling like we don't know what the context of reception is.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know if that helps, but.
No, it helped. It helped.
Thanks very much, Motlatsi. I'm going to call on Alex to pose a question, Jason. Can you handle another one?
Yeah, I'm here for it.
Okay, Alex, can I ask you? Yeah, there you are. Great, thank you.
Hey, this has been a little while. Really nice to hear your talk. I think when I was thinking about the example you gave and like the use of humor was, I think for me, it seemed like a way of dealing with the ambivalence that people feel when it comes to, I think, sticky questions around race. And then I think in South Africa, they can be, you know, hard to put down like a concrete flag when there's situations that are as seemingly absurd and also complex as the Touch Me in My Studio one. So I wonder if humor is really also a way that we can try put off having to make more concrete stances in complex situations like that, I guess, is my thinking. So it's sort of the ambivalence of humor allows you to laugh in the face of complex, ambivalent situations. I guess it's kind of like a reflection and a question on the role of ambivalence there, I guess. But thank you. It was a really interesting talk and nice to hear you again.
Thanks, Alex. And you hit a solid point. And I enjoy, by the way, that this is seeing so many people I haven't spoken to face-to-face in a while. I think ambivalence is a big part of it. And I feel like that's implicit in the tension, right? So when we go back to the idea of the evil demon in the election key, the idea is that we know that what we do has meaning, right? We know that there is a lot of meaning that is attached to it. It's freighted with purpose. And that's true in our racial interactions where we can't be certain of what our actions translate as and to who will take us as an ally or an opponent based on our engagements. And despite trying quite hard to do that, we know it matters. We just don't know how it matters or in what ways it will be understood as mattering. And you know, the same with the anti-vaxxing and mask wearing under certain circumstances. I think that I don't want to have undersold the amount of tension that we experience. It is a lot of pressure. We know these things are important, but we don't have nearby ways of resolving them. And I think it might be that you're pointing to something very important. At the very least, when we say it, I may have been too quick simply to say we point to the absurd. We might say, look at how absurd it is that this meaning is ambivalent. Look at this thing that we encase in a sense of shocked absurdity. Isn't it weird? And that's not necessarily resolving its meaning, but it does turn into let's get together and swap notes over Twitter attached to this hashtag about our various experiences of how weird this thing is. So I think you're right. There's a sense in which we use this as a way of containing ambivalent or multivalent meanings. But what we're doing is marking them as something we're all invested in, and with some kind of a shared perspective. This is noteworthy, not in that it's reinforcing the ways it had been read before. So it wasn't Mr. Versace's sense of who had a right to speak that came out of that unscathed. It was a collective sense from various angles. Well, this devolved into something very strange. And that's still what we can point to when we talk about Don't Touch Me on My Studio. So there's a sense in which things don't get resolved and remain somewhat ambivalent, but it's also a reaffirming that the meanings that had existed prior to these shared moments, that isn't the meaning that persists. And yeah, you've hit something very useful there. I will be quiet now.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Alex. Great to see that you joined us, even though it seems like you're on your phone somewhere else. So thanks very much. And thank you for your question. Before I hand over to Andrea and she ends us off for the session, Jason, again, thank you so much. And I hope you'll continue to come to our seminars and not spill any more coffee on your laptop so that you're out MIA for a while. So thanks very much. That was thoroughly enjoyable as always.
Yeah, I agree with Jenna. Thanks so much. I mean, I think one of the takeaways that I took from this is this idea that maybe humor is associated with absurdity, which opens up all this ambiguity, whereas maybe moral shock kind of shuts down the ambiguity, which is why we can't really laugh. So there's something very close to humor and between humor and ambiguity and absurdity. It was really a wonderful talk, lots to listen to, and I completely agree with Helen that I'm very much looking forward to re-looking at it on YouTube. So we will post it up there, and if anybody wants to kind of go back into the ideas, there were just too many to think about, then it will be on YouTube. So Jason, thanks so much. That was a fascinating talk. And just to say that next week we will have a seminar by Tobias Scheel on humor at work, which will be kind of interesting too. So I'm looking forward to that. So thanks everybody, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week, I hope. Cheers.